So as Christine said, my name is Dahlbeck. I work for Action Aid UK. Can I just have a quick check how many people have heard of Action Aid before? It's okay to say no?
Yes.
So most people have heard of Action Aid. So you will know that we are an NGO, a non-governmental organization, charity, working mainly on international development issues, trying to eradicate global poverty. Very small and doable goal. So that's who we are. We are headquartered in Johannesburg, which is quite unusual. If you think about a lot of the other big NGOs doing similar work to us, such as Oxfam or Save the Children, Christian Aid and so on, you would think of them as British charities based here in the UK. But we're actually headquartered in Johannesburg, because we thought it was important that an organization like ours should actually be run closer to the people who actually benefit from our work. So we're present in about 45 countries, so I would say 7 or 8 of them are in sort of Europe or US, Australia, and the other ones are primarily in Asia and in Africa. And we have some offices in South America as well. Traditionally, our organization used to, if you look at the history, it started in the 70s. And in its origins, we were sort of doing quite traditional international development charity stuff. Collected a lot of money in countries like the UK, sent it to places like Africa in order to spend it on education, health, feeding people who had no food and so on. That model has changed quite a lot, and I'll talk about that a bit later so that you can also understand why an organization like ours would be interested in tax. But also, we have more and more moved to a model where we realize that the world's rich aren't necessarily based in Europe or the US. It doesn't really make sense to have a model whereby we're sort of fundraising in the global north and then spending money in the global south. There are lots of people who are poor here in Europe as well, and there are lots of people who are rich in countries like Brazil, India, and so on. And so our model has changed quite a lot, whereby we now fundraise from wealthy people also in particularly the BRICS, but also other countries. And we very slowly started some work to work with poverty in Europe, particularly in Greece, where we have food banks and other ways of helping poor people. So in terms of kind of areas that we work on, we're here to talk about our tax justice work. But we also work primarily on women's rights, food rights, governance, and accountability. Governance and accountability is extremely important in a lot of countries we work in Africa and Asia, where the accountability of government or local authorities can be quite low. There isn't always that much insight and transparency into where all the money goes. So just educating people on how to do what we call budget tracking, just seeing where's my tax money going, what is my government and my local authority spending the money on, and holding them to account when the money is in various ways wasted is incredibly powerful. I should have said directly from the beginning, if there are any points of clarification throughout the presentation, please just stop me. And as most of you will have picked up, I'm not an English native speaker, so if I say something, if I pronounce something in a way you just don't understand what I'm talking about, or just, sorry, I didn't understand what you said. If you have anything you particularly want to discuss or challenge me on, you might want to save that towards the end so we can have a bigger discussion. But if there are points of clarification or something that you just don't understand, please do stop me. But the thing we're here to talk about today is tax justice. And as I mentioned before, we started realizing as an organization sometime in the 80s that just collecting money from slightly better off citizens in the north of the world and in various ways distributing it among people living in poverty in the south wasn't necessarily a sustainable model. It's a necessary model because people who live in direct absolute poverty, they need vaccines now, they need food aid now, they need education now. But like a lot of the rich public says whenever they see these comic relief other shows, they say, we give money every year and still people are poor. Nothing's changing. Is this really helping? It's helping solve people's problems day to day, but it's not really changing the reason why they're poor in the first place. And our tax justice campaign was very much launched in response to some of the more sort of systematic issues that actually keep people in extreme poverty. So tax justice, why? Well, first of all, let's just establish what taxes does. Because I know it can be quite a controversial issue, and it can be quite a political issue when you discuss taxes. Most at least here in Europe, sort of political agenda is also who's going to cut more taxes for me, my business, my family, or whatever. ActionAid wouldn't go into that level of politics, but it is important to remember why we have taxes in the first place. Obviously, it pays teachers, it trains nurses, it maintains roads, delivers medicine, provides clean water, and many other things. Things that we can't take for granted, don't we, but they really aren't things that a lot of people in other continents take for granted. Tax is also the most important, sustainable, and predictable is important here, source of public finance for almost all countries. A lot of, particularly African countries, obviously make a lot of money out of extractives. They have a lot of minerals and other things that they can just sell, but it can be a rather unpredictable source of income. Both because the commodity price changes up and down, and for lots of other reasons. So having a steady stream of predictable tax makes a functioning government much easier, and that is particularly important in many poor countries. There we go. So if countries are to eradicate poverty and hunger, they will need to do so by increasing their own public finances, principally through tax revenues. Again, I know taxes can be a very political and sensitive issue, but if we want countries such as Mozambique, Tanzania, and so on, to actually have the means to deal with the problems in education, health, and so on, there will need to be tax revenue. But as you can see, as most of you might know, Africa's economy is actually booming. It's growing really rapidly, while people are talking about austerity measures and a sort of global financial crisis. The financial crisis is very present in some parts of the world, others not so much. Africa is one of the parts of the world where things are going quite well right now financially. Yet education, child mortality, nutrition levels, and many other indicators of poverty and well-being, they just aren't improving at the same rate. So how come the overall economy is growing, yet lots of these problems aren't being addressed? And the lack of a viable tax base with which to address these issues is a key factor. These countries that have most of the world's extremely poor people in them simply do not have the means to actually address the issues that face them, such as some of the ones mentioned above. So let's quickly give an example of Zambia, because we're going to talk about Zambia later when we get into more of our sort of day-to-day work and how it might relate to some of the issues that you might come across in your professional life. In Zambia, 90% of the rural population live in poverty. 45% of all children suffer from malnutrition, and many are stunted in their growth. Yet, Zambia has recently graduated from being considered a low-income country to a lower middle-income country. That has a lot of implications, especially when it comes to governments giving aid. The governments don't tend to like giving aid to middle-income countries because they say, why should we pay for fighting poverty in a country where actually they're not that poor? So the country seems to be doing well if you just look at their GDP, but somehow lots of people are still living in poverty. So, what I'm going to address today are some issues relating to tax and specifically the behavior of transnational corporations. So here in the UK, obviously, we've heard a lot about Starbucks, Google, and Amazon. You will have all read the news. You might have had closer insights than that into their dealings. And we know that they have found ways to pay little or no tax here in the UK, which obviously affects the UK economy and rather the state's ability to provide various services quite a lot. What we address as ActionAid are primarily TNCs, or transnational companies that operate in the global south, in Africa, in Asia, and parts of South America, and the way that they deal with their tax affairs. Again, like I mentioned before, tax revenue is needed by developing countries in order to provide basic services like healthcare and education, but domestic resource mobilization can be challenging. By domestic resource mobilization, I mean taxation, getting money from state-run companies. And trust me, this thing I say, even though most people might find it political, very few, if any, poor countries want to rely on aid. They want to move away from a model whereby they need aid from other countries in order to do their day-to-day business. They want to be able to mobilize their resources through domestic resources, primarily tax. So this is just as a way of introduction as to why we as a development organization would look at tax. So our campaign is global. We focus on tax dodging in developing countries, mainly by transnational corporations, as I've said. We do a lot of campaigning here in Europe and in the US and Australia, in various countries where we have offices, looking at companies from those countries and how they behave when they have operations in many countries, especially then in poor countries. But we also obviously do a lot of campaigning on the other side, and I really want to emphasize that, because often when I talk about financial problems that exist in poorer countries, people challenge me by saying, yeah, but what about what's happening in this country, or I've heard or I've read that there might be corruption, or there might, this country has responsibility as well to make sure that that they provide their citizens with decent services which they need decent tax base for. Obviously, we are doing lots of campaigning in countries like Zambia, Kenya, Nepal, and so on, making sure that their tax laws are fit for purpose. But also, as I mentioned before, we have a whole stream of work around governance and accountability, ensuring that once the money ends up in those government coffers, they're actually spent the way they should be spent. So I wanted to show you some pictures of the campaigning we've done before I go into the details, just give you a flavor. So this would be an example of kind of campaigning we do in the UK. This is, I think it's actually set up on the South Bank in London. We set up a little fake tax haven in Shady Island, which people stopped and sort of asked questions, what's this all about, and we could explain our campaign. So we do a lot of work here in the UK, especially with young people, to raise awareness of these issues and get them involved in the campaign. But obviously we talk to politicians as well. I don't know their names, but the two men in black in the middle are MPs, and people in red are our activists. So we have quite a few members of parliament who are actually on side of our campaign. But as I said, our campaign runs very much in the global south as well. So this is an example of, I think this is taken in Zambia, of a campaign we ran where people made sign of what tax paid for in their country and then put it up on Twitter. So if you go to hashtag taxpays if you're on Twitter, you'll find lots of nice pictures from all over the world of people explaining what tax pays for. And this is saying our work. Okay. So that was all just explaining a little bit again who we are, why we work on this, and what we do globally. I'll now focus in a bit more concretely what it is that we work on. So if you look at tax losses for any state, although, as I said, we are now focusing here on developing countries, there are various ways that they can lose their tax base, face erosion, for sure, so we'll talk about this more later. On one hand of the spectrum, you have evasion, fraud. Actually, it doesn't work on this simply because it's criminal. No one should engage in evasion. Tax evasion is criminal. I hope we don't need a public campaign about people not acting criminally. On the other hand, you can have a erosion of tax base through very, very low taxes. Again, actually, it tends not to get involved in that because it's political. It's up to each country where they want to put their taxes, really, as long as it's within reason. So we focus on tax avoidance and tax incentives that both work to erode the tax base in many developing countries. On the right-hand side, we've just created this one. This is a conceptual spectrum between can't tax and won't tax. This is where the government can't tax. If someone is engaging in tax evasion or fraud, there's no way the government can get their hands on this because it never sort of passes through the government's eye. Tax avoidance and tax planning, it's harder because it's often done in a very sneaky way. As many of you might be aware of ways that can be done, and we'll talk through later the dynamics of how it's done. But they definitely can tax it if they close various tax loopholes through which tax money is sort of drained out of the system. Tax incentives are very much in the control of governments, which is why we put close to won't tax as something they don't want to. And tax rates, again, governments decide that themselves. They have complete sovereignty over that. So make a distinction between which can't tax and what governments just won't tax. So I'm going to start by talking through tax incentives a little bit. So tax incentives, so it's a change in a country's tax code aimed at incentivizing a particular economic activity. Very often can be very legitimate. I mean, in many countries, for example, you would have tax breaks for companies producing green energy. So in various ways you want to encourage these companies to exist, you want them to grow, you realize that in the short run they might not be that competitive, but you want that industry, so you provide an incentive companies to go in that direction. But it's always worth asking why incentives are there, especially in developing countries. We'll get to it later, but very often extractive industries, companies that move into extractive industries get very big tax incentives. They may get a total tax holiday, so no tax at all for 5 or 10 years. Or while domestic companies might be taxed at one rate, an international company going in and working in the extractives industry might get a much lower tax rate. You might want to ask why. Oil, gas, these are very profitable businesses. Do they really need a tax break in order to operate? So there are various forms of tax incentives. I assume many of you will be familiar with these. I just want to run them through. Some of you might have done this part of accountancy. So just tax relief. So basically you offset investments and research and development costs and other things against your tax bill. Tax holidays, again, when the government might say, you don't have to pay any tax for the first 10 years here as long as you can. Relief on corporate income taxes or indirect taxes. Free trade zones, some of you might be familiar with, many countries operate small bits of a country which somehow doesn't follow the rules of the rest of the country. They are export processing zones, that's what they call it in some countries. We're now about 43 million people, we're probably about 10 years ago, about to be more, in these little trade zones in various countries that often are tax exempt. Accelerated depreciation and deferred taxes, that's another tax incentive. Exempting foreign staff from income tax is very common in a lot of countries. And stability agreement. So stability agreement can be quite harmful. Fundamentally, the easiest way of explaining this is to say that at the time that a company moves into a certain country, starts doing business, they get the tax incentives, and then they can sign a clause saying this will be the deal for as long as we're in the country. So let's say you have a country with a corporate income tax of 15%. They have a stability agreement. 4 years later, for financial reasons, the government has put it up to 20%, but it won't affect this company because they have their stability agreement. So while all other companies, including domestic companies, have to pay a higher corporate income tax, this particular company won't have to because they have stability agreement. I'm seeing a little bit slow because I need to speed it up, so my apologies. There are two kinds of tax incentives, statutory and discretionary. If you look at the statutory one, so they give it to everyone that meets a certain criteria. For example, the farming sector in Zambia, they all have quite low corporate income tax because food is a scarce product in Zambia, and so governments want to make sure that companies operating in the agricultural sector can produce without having too much tax. Let's skip the Zambia Sugar for now. Ghana, they have a 5-year tax holiday for investments in agricultural processing. Again, for the same reason, they want to find ways of so people can produce cheap food for the population. But Cargill and Nestle are among those who benefit from it, and again, without knowing the intricacies of those companies' balance sheets, we know that they don't really need a tax holiday. They're making billions across the world. Why they need to not pay tax in order to operate slightly. Meanwhile, obviously, Ghana is losing out on the tax rate that could be spent on things we discussed before, education, health. But then we have discretionary incentives as well. So remember, the statutory ones were the same for everyone. Discretionary ones, they give it to individual companies, often big multinational companies, giving them advantage for domestic companies. And the exact details are often not public. Even more worrying is that very often discretionary incentives are given by a chamber of commerce or some sort of import-export council. There's very little parliamentary scrutiny over it, and the government often doesn't get involved. So it's not a matter of the government of a particular country saying, great, we have lots of mining potential in our country. I think it would be great if we got some European companies with lots of know-how who can come here and do mining here and employ lots of people. It's often done by very small, obscure tradeways. One example, for example, is Pan-Africa Energy. So this is a company based in Jersey, which I think most of you know is considered a tax haven money. Created with huge aid money, and said that they would produce energy for Africa. They got a discretionary 25 years tax holiday for exploiting gas fields in Tanzania. Again, gas is quite a profitable business. They're not paying tax in Tanzania. They're not even paying tax anywhere else. But you might say, well, someone put money at risk here. Not really. They got money from Swedish state aid money. They didn't ask anything in return. You might say Pan-Africa Energy has been very clever. But the question is anyone apart from Pan-Africa actually benefiting from this? Jersey is not benefiting. Tanzania is not benefiting. Sweden is just giving money to them. It's a very good deal for them, not a very good deal, especially for the people of Tanzania. So I want to talk through also a few developments in sub-Saharan Africa regarding tax incentives. So countries with economic free trade zones. In 1980, about 3% of them had. In 2005, there was up to almost half of all African countries now have these zones, which are meant to attract investments that otherwise would come to their country. Countries with reduced corporate income tax through tax incentives, again from 10 to 51%. We've done some calculations what this actually costs, comparing a simple scenario if everyone was paying the corporate income tax stipulated, and then comparing that to reality where some sectors or companies are getting tax breaks. So in Malawi, again without knowing much about Malawi, we can easily say it's one of the poorest countries in the world with very high incidence, especially of HIV and AIDS. In between 2008 and 2012, they lost roughly 3.3 billion just from reduced corporate income tax for certain sectors and companies. In Kenya, the figure was 158 million in 2008. And just to sort of put this into context, so in Tanzania, the tax that was foregone to Pan-Africa Energy, if they would have paid actually a full corporate income tax, that could have paid 175,000 euros to go to school for a year. So this is money that these countries desperately need. In Zambia, the tax foregone to the Zambia Sugar, a company we're going to look at slightly later, alone, so just that one company, could have paid for nutritional interventions to eliminate all child malnutrition in Zambia. And that's just one company. So what this gives a little bit of idea of why these kind of tax incentives, while they might be good for the company coming into these countries, they do cost quite a lot of money in those countries. So in percentages then, looking at statutory income tax foregone due to tax incentives, we have Mozambique giving up 77%, Uruguay 66%, and Kenya 21%. The reason why we only look at the statutory one is because we don't know the discretionary one. We don't know what tax breaks have been given to a lot of companies operating in those countries. So this is just from the sectors where there is a law that applies to everyone. Might skip this quickly as well. It's just looking again by country, and then globally, more than 138 billion per year is foregone to corporate income tax incentives. Now that includes tax breaks in rich countries as well, not just in poor countries. And again, just to sort of put that into context, that is more than all the development aid of all countries in the world put together. And that's just one of the many types of tax incentives that we described before. I don't know if you remember, I had a slide with about 10 of them. So that's just from one type, tax incentive. But the interesting thing then is this really necessary? We're looking again at specifically now the African context, to be honest, more than anything else. So a recent World Bank survey showed that 93% of investors that they would have invested anyway in those countries, even if the incentives hadn't been on offer. And that's very often because many of these companies investing, well in this case in East Africa, they're investing in things that only really exist there. And we're looking then again particularly, not only in East Africa, but in Africa in general, at various minerals or other commodities and resources that you can't just generate somewhere else. You have to go there to get them. And then here's a quote by Uganda's finance minister. I don't know anything about her. I don't know if she's so good in other sectors. I'm better than this endorsing her. So if someone knows about her and has something bad about her, I'm not endorsing her. But she said that investors, they want cold weather, good roads, piped water and electricity. The government needs to provide these, but how shall we deliver such infrastructure if you're busy out of tax exemptions? Where will we get the money? So obviously this is a fair point also from an investor. It makes sense for you to invest in a country where you have a good port, a good airport, good transport links generally, a healthy population, decently educated population, and so on. But how are countries supposed to provide that if you yourself are requiring another taxpayer to do that? This is two more surveys, or two more reports, same one as the same thing. So G20, 2011, show that it actually, you can read yourselves. So having these kind of tax incentives, they may attract some short-term investment in that. It's not really leading to any development. It's not really benefiting the poor. So in terms of what action it wants then, looking specifically at tax incentives. It's a difficult one because sometimes, as I said at the beginning, sometimes you do need a tax incentive just to attract a little bit of investments in specific sectors that you feel might need it. But generally, the idea of a tax holiday is quite bad. The idea that a company would come in and simply not pay any tax at all for a period of time. One of the problems with that is that if you have a company which sets itself up, doesn't pay tax for 5 years, they're going to be in a very strong position to negotiate another tax holiday for another 5 years, another 5 years, and another 5 years. It's very hard to give a tax holiday and then take it away. We would also want all phases of new incentives to require parliamentary approval. Again, while democracy might not work perfectly in all southern countries, it is a means to have some sort of public and democratic control of where these incentives are given. And also, the last one is quite important, to coordinate any tax incentives with neighboring countries, because there is a race to the bottom, of course. Let's say you are 4 countries right next to each other, and you all have the same resources, whether it's a specific metal or whether it's a specific other commodity. If one of you set your corporate income tax at 10%, the next one might say, well, I'll set it at 5%, and I'll give you some other incentives as well. A third one might go, okay, I'm going to go a bit lower, and they're all going to go lower until basically all end up at 0. So if you have a group of neighboring countries, it doesn't make sense for them to coordinate themselves among themselves so that they don't just have a race to the bottom, a race to 0, basically, in terms of tax. So that's tax incentives. We move on to tax avoidance now. And I'm sorry that I was speaking through it because I realized I was taking on that. Tax avoidance. So there are many ways of engaging in tax avoidance. One of the easiest ways is to route in your monies, your profits, through tax havens or low tax jurisdictions where a particular type of income is tax exempt. So this one is particularly interesting because even though we did this little fake tax haven, as I said, in Dahlbeck in London, where we put a palm tree and it was all sunny, that's one idea of tax haven. Basically, there are particular types of income, can be on interest payments, can be on royalty payments, management fees, and so on, that might sit within a jurisdiction such as the UK or the Netherlands or Belgium or within Delaware, as it were, in the US, where the whole country, the whole state is in the same tax haven. There are specific things that make it attractive to route your money through that particular country. You might also want to route your money through a jurisdiction where income can be set off against other losses. So very simply, if you make massive profits in country A, but making massive losses in country B, rather than paying lots of tax on the money here and this money just being lost, you might find ways of shifting that money over there, and in the end, you might break even, but you're not paying any tax. And also, you might want to shift your money to a jurisdiction in which tax on the income can be deferred. The US is quite a good one for that. You can defer tax for quite a long time in the US. I'm not going to talk much more about this because I assume that some of you will already have quite a lot of knowledge about how these dynamics work. And also, I think some might speak a bit more about that. So one of the issues that actually I'm taking particularly interesting is transfer pricing, or mispricing, as it were. So, looking at the arm's length principle, again, many of you will be familiar with this. A company with a presence in, or presences in many different countries across the world, including the tax havens, where you pay consultancy services or where none might take place, just as a way of shifting money to a tax haven. or to a low tax jurisdiction. Payments from a country where we have high tax for things such as brand, risk, and goodwill, to a country where we pay little or no tax, or debt. So again, interest payments from one country to another as a way of shifting your profit from a higher tax jurisdiction to lower tax jurisdiction. So we're going to talk a little bit about Zambia Sugar now, which is a company that we work quite a lot with. Zambia Sugar is quite a small company, based in Zambia, obviously. It's part of a bigger entity in Africa called LOA, and then that's part of ABF, that some of you might have heard of, which is a UK-based company. There's a link to that. And so ABF have brands like Rivita and so on in this country, and they own prime markets. So, for example, Zambia Sugar, so basically they get all the sugar, they process it, and there should in theory be financial profit in Zambia. They paid up large purchasing and management fees to an Irish sister company, a company that seems to have no fiscal presence in Ireland. So if you go to Ireland, it is no company. But every year since 2006, also this company has audited, well, their audited accounts. They repeatedly stated that the company has no employees, there's no office, there's no employees. Still, Zambia Sugar is paying nearly 2.6 million worth of management fees, services to this company every year. There is no company, but there's a post box, obviously. There's some sort of, there's no office, there's no person. This is just shifting profits to Ireland. Again, working with details, but I guess many of you know that Ireland, for some reasons, can be considered a tax haven. So, the Dublin Dog, I guess we call it. Again, I think most of you know how this works, but I will talk through it just in case there's something about this. So another way of doing this is Zambia Sugar, who might not need a loan, has taken a $70 million loan from a bank based in the UK, Citibank and Standard Bank. If they were paying interest, the Zambian government would have hold a 10% withholding tax. However, if it's actually taken by Ireland, so the sister company, they take the loan, and then they lend it on, and between these two countries, there is no withholding tax. They have a tax treaty which says between Ireland and Zambia, you don't have withholding tax. There's no such treaty between Zambia and the UK. The money goes there, no withholding tax. From Ireland to UK, again, no withholding tax within the EU. So you're not paying tax basically. But let's get that one. And Ireland is quite a specific case right now in Europe, not the only one by far by any means. But a lot of companies are choosing to root profits in there, because then once you start shipping right now EU countries, you don't have to worry so much about these kind of implications. But this is what Zambia Sugar did. Something else that Zambia Sugar Company did, they took the Zambian Revenue Authority to court because they wanted to be considered their revenues as farming income. Now they're not really a farming company. So about 75% of their income come from industrial sugar manufacture. So again, it's not farming, it's in factory. And they buy a lot of their sugar from independent growers. So the actual farming activity, they don't do it, they process. They managed to take the Zambia Revenue Authority to court, and for reasons unknown, they won, which means that they managed to reduce their tax rate from 35% to 15% on their farming income. So they're doing whatever they can basically to pay very, very tax in Zambia. And again, here I would like to remind us of the figures we saw at the beginning, where 90% of people living in rural settings in Zambia are poor, and 45% of our kids are not neutered and stunting. So it's a country that could do with money, a lot more than India. Again, just going through some of the ways that they've shifted money around. So we've seen a little bit about how money goes from Zambia to Ireland. We have roughly 2.5 million management fees. This is a content fee of 2 million. And 3.4 million unspecified financial flows to Ireland, where again, remember, there is no companies, that's no fees. Also, $3 million US a year going as export agency commission payments to Mauritius, where they had no staff. And where they're based in this building, where I think a few thousand companies are based. None of them have any fees there, just hospitals. Again, just putting things into context. So ABF's tax dodging and using ABF as shorthand here for Zambia Sugar is fundamentally the same family of companies. As part of Zambia Public First was more than 14 times larger what the UK aid to Zambia to combat hunger and food insecurities during the same period. If you add in the effect of special tax breaks that Zambia Sugar received, so not only are they avoiding tax, they have tax incentive, like they got tax breaks when they first came. And all the foreign tax revenues in a single year, they could likely have, as I mentioned actually at the start, could have covered the entire cost of the interventions needed to tackle child malnutrition in Zambia. So from one company alone, there's only one of all the companies operating in Zambia. If they just pay taxes the way a Zambian company does, because they don't get any of this, they could have basically had all the financing they needed to tackle child malnutrition in Zambia. So let's look a bit. Obviously, this is only possible because there are tax havens and what we call harmful regimes. So harmful regime would be, again, to some extent the UK, the Netherlands, Belgium, Delaware. I'm just giving you a few examples. They aren't necessarily zero tax places, but have parts of their jurisdiction which are harmful for international tax purposes. They need to exist in all politics of what tax orders happen. So let's look at one of them. Let's look at Mauritius, which is very popular right now. So a flat rate of 15% tax for both corporations and individuals. They have no capital gains tax, no inheritance, wealth or gift tax, no control from company legislation, no transfer pricing rules at all, and no withholding tax on dividends, interest or royalty payments. As we just saw in the previous example, these are three of the key ways that money is being shifted between countries. And this was really easy to find out. I didn't need to do any research. This was from a presentation that Deloitte made to Chinese investors that were in China recently, explaining how investing in Africa through Mauritius is a great idea. And this presentation was online. Continuing, and again, this is actually literally copied from Deloitte presentation to Chinese investors looking to invest in Africa. As you know, Chinese are investing in a lot of Africa right now. So they're looking at if a Chinese company wants to invest directly in Mozambique, you would have to pay interest, royalties, technical fees, withholding taxes and dividends. And if China Holding disposes of its investment interest in Mozambique, this would trigger a capital gains tax of 33% in Mozambique. However, if the company payments by way of dividends paid through the Mauritius holding company, when they go back to China holding company, they would reduce the withholding tax applying to the Mauritius treaty, no withholding tax on outbound payments, as we saw before, no capital gains tax, and all the rest. So the Mauritius, as we saw before, tax haven, Deloitte promoting them very heavily to Chinese investors who want to invest in Africa, which now right now is a huge source of investment in Africa. African governments ending up with very little. This is just another example. This is another company that we have worked on, Miller. They produce a lot of beer. You might know Grolsch, you might know other brands. I don't know if it's visible from where you are. We tried to show where they do start and then where their money is routed to, so where they pay taxes. So the yellow, so beer marks, that's usually music. That's the yellow ones, that's where stuff happens, production. The red ones, so Mauritius, Gibraltar, Jersey, Guernsey, Ireland, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, Switzerland, and Cyprus, and Hong Kong, that's where profits end up and whether taxed or not, as it were. Quite a tough picture.
Is that slide showing no correlation at all? The reds and the yellows don't overlap.
I don't want to say actually. I should make a disclaimer. I think
that's what that's implying.
It's implying, but I was just thinking now that I don't want to say that they pay absolutely zero tax in these countries, like the other ones. Someone might come back and see them. So, by and large, this is where the money should be to. I should probably. Yeah. And then another one, which we have a campaign on right now, actually is Barclays. Barclays is also having their corporate investment brochures, selling Mauritius as a great way of investing in Africa. And so we're running quite a big campaign. If any of you by chance want to go to our website, you'll see quite a lot of our campaigns materials on that. We also have a report which goes into detail about how Barclays is set up in this. And the reason we have addressed Barclays is because they're really selling themselves as the sort of go-to bank in Africa. And so we run a campaign for most of them to clean up their act on tax havens. So it's not just the big accounting firms like Deloitte, it's also banks obviously that facilitate this. Because we're running out of time. So this I think we will hear more from later from Sol, no? So one thing obviously that we need, if we are to improve the system at all, is for government to be more transparent about what's actually happening. So first of all, country by country reporting. So for each company to actually report what activity and what profits they have in each individual country. From consolidated accounts now, if you go through them, you rarely find that. Vodafone has actually started doing it, which was quite interesting. It wasn't perfect, but at least they had a list of different countries and how much tax they pay in each one of those. And automatic exchange of information between states, which is the case right now, about tax payment. And beneficial ownership. Some of you might have heard of this recently, because David Cameron came out with a statement that the UK will now make a public registry of beneficial ownership of a company. So you will actually know who is the ultimate benefiter from the company, not just a company owned by company owned by company, who actually is behind this company, beneficial ownership. But there are some concerning developments as well. Again, I'm very aware that we're running out of time. UK patent box, so a way for patents to be based in the UK, sub subsidiaries to pay royalties for the right of a particular patent, and that not being taxed in the UK. So it's a way of shifting profit via the UK. So again, coming back to the idea that a tax haven isn't just a sunny island in the Caribbean. Mauritius more being sold as the gateway to Africa. I mean, by far the biggest investor on paper in Kenya is Mauritius. No country invests as much money in Africa as Mauritius. Why? Well, obviously because it's actually a holding company in Mauritius that is officially investing money in Mauritius. The actual company isn't based, obviously. But on paper, because Mauritius is the biggest investor. This move towards tax avoidance through non-tax havens, which makes it harder and harder, again, coming back to the UK patent box. Won't get more into detail on that one now. More and more corporate lobbying for policy change and incentives. Again, we don't have much time to go through it, but obviously when you have a big tax break in a country, I'm thinking specifically about certain industries, the oil industry in many African countries, massive tax breaks for companies. In Nigeria, for example, why does the oil industry have tax breaks in Nigeria? I think it's quite profitable. There's a lot of corporate lobbying behind the scenes, and I won't go into the exact dynamic as to why that incentive might be given. So I'm going to finish up here. So the last bit was a bit rushed. But just to remind, this is again one of our campaigning actions. I think this is also in Zambia, so we have quite a lot there. Tax pays for education is obviously children in the school. That's it. Thank you very much for your attention, and if you have any questions, you have 5 minutes.